All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast, live here from RSA. Cassie Crossley, the Vice President of Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric, is my guest. And we're going to talk about something I don't know a lot about, which is the hardware bills of materials. So I am very glad you're here to kind of explain and enlighten us all on this. So.
Right. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, nice to meet you. How's the show going for you? I know we're at the tail end here finally.
Good. So. Definitely exhausting. Always is.
Yeah,
but I
absolutely.
love it. I love seeing people I know and meeting new people.
Yeah. So like I said, do they call them HBOMs? It's kind of
They do. Just don't do it in an airport.
Yeah, not a good idea.
Yeah.
Definitely not a good idea. So honestly, I haven't heard a lot about this.
Sure.
Why isn't there more buzz about these things? You hear about SBOMs all the time. But
Right. So, well, many things that we have in our life, they're software only.
Okay.
So, what's on your laptop, lots of software. And really, as a consumer or just a normal IT staff or anybody else, do you really want to know all the details inside the laptop? Does it matter?
Sure.
Well, probably only when there's a vulnerability or something major you can't fix, like we've seen in the past when there's chips that could potentially, if you fix it, brick computers or
Right.
stuff like that. So from a hardware standpoint, the bill of materials is not generally necessary unless you're doing repairs or unless you're concerned about something that might have been put inside whatever it is you're buying. So that's why you don't generally care about it.
But structurally, it's basically the same. It's just a component list and machine readable, I assume.
Yeah, so it's a hardware bill of materials could be everything in there, which could be non-intelligent components, non-digital components. So it could have capacitors or just anything, right? You've all seen green boards; those are printed circuit boards. So it can have things other than a chip that is digital. So generally, when we're talking about hardware bill of materials, if we're giving it to someone, we focus on the intelligent components, the integrated circuits, the semiconductor chips, just basically that, because otherwise it'd be way too much detail for the general person. And I would say that you would think that it's machine readable, and the formats that cover software bill of materials, SBOMs, like Cyclone DX and SPDX, do have the capability to provide that hardware information. However, most of the hardware bill of materials, when we provide it to somebody, it's in an Excel spreadsheet today because there's not technology that can easily produce it.
Okay.
And there's not technology that can easily ingest it to take it in, like we're seeing now with software bill of materials.
So, do you have a sense for, the percentage of vendors that are offering them or customers that are asking for them? How...
In the critical infrastructure space, we are definitely being asked for them for certain areas, and it's usually because of a regulatory reason. In the U.S., for example, if you're selling into the U.S. government, for many years, they've had something called, in the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, a Section 889 saying you can't be using Huawei in your business, you can't be selling us anything with Huawei and other companies. And there's something coming in the future that they haven't written the whole rule on called Section 5949, and that specifically lists certain Chinese chips. And so that's much more difficult because it's not only those companies providing you services, which in an HBOM it would show, but it also says the fourth party, like all their suppliers. Well, that's pretty impossible.
Sure.
So from a hardware bill of materials, we've gotten requests from U.S. government entities, also other asset owners or customers that are in critical infrastructure because they have to comply. But the usual, customer, let's say we sell products into manufacturing environments, they don't ask for hardware bill of materials.
Okay. But for those that do, that visibility is huge.
It is, and
especially on the regulatory front.
Yes, and will be very difficult to bring together.
Yeah. So is that the biggest use case, the compliance aspect of it?
At this time, yes.
Yeah.
From a traceability standpoint, others, it's because the hardware bill of materials, let's say I produce or Apple produces the iPhone in multiple locations. Well, they have a custom chip, that the main brains of it.
Sure.
But a lot of the products whether it be a router or a laptop. Some of those chips are just common components. So you could have different suppliers.
Yeah.
And you could have different locations that those suppliers are buying from, even though it's the same chip that you qualified.
Right.
So that means on Monday, when that laptop is produced, could have a different set of chips on Thursday because they changed out the line. Or
Makes
it could
sense.
be different, if this one came from, assembled in Mexico versus one that might be assembled in Madrid, Spain, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the different sources. So when you ask for a hardware bill of materials, there's many verifications because the manufacturing bill of materials changes. And so you really have to give the full aspect of what are the possibilities.
Yeah.
But then those possibilities is just statistically math, where it's like you can have X number of combinations. So finding out exactly what's in that one has to be figured out directly on the line, and manufacturing processes in general are not tracing this is the exact serial number that went into that one.
That granularity sounds like it makes it really complex.
It is. And understanding, and what we need is really more of a collective group to work on the hardware bill of materials, that talk about how do we handle this.
Sure.
There is a framework that was documented through a CISA supply chain risk management group, and that document's available on the CISA website. And then MITRE has done some documentation really to focus on semiconductor manufacturing.
Yep.
And I'm talking more about commercial products that have multiple chips coming from who knows where.
Right. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And in terms of, adoption on the vendor side, any reason they would be hesitant? Is there any proprietary stuff they wouldn't want to share, or is that kind of out of scope already?
Well, I would say you could say there's proprietary information, but if you open up that item, you can usually tell what's in there. The reason is that it's more complicated to pull than almost everything, because that information could be in the enterprise resource planning systems of their systems, and they could have multiple. It could be in the manufacturing line, like I said.
Yeah.
You could have multiple chips and suppliers, and then there's information that can change based off of the supplier data, which they might not tell you about. So let's say you're buying a chip from a certain supplier for this part number, and they had been manufacturing, what's called the front end and the back end. There's two different main processes where there could be cyber risk injected,
Sure.
as part of the process. And we've, heard, and of course the risk for semiconductor manufacturing. And so let's say 1 month they're producing in Malaysia and then Taiwan for front end and back end, and then they decide to move manufacturing to Philippines. And so how does the supplier give us that updated information?
Right.
So we've got a whole process flow that gets very complicated, and the systems that are managing these ERPs and such are not really coordinated between the thousands of suppliers.
Mm-hmm. So are there certain features that matter more maybe than others, like standardized naming or other kinds of formats, et cetera?
Yeah, it can be very difficult for a part, because if there's, let's just say, chips that are not the most current technologies like we see now with AI.
Sure.
And phones and such. And a lot of these industrial products or regular IoT products are using chips that were designed a decade or more ago. And there's not any intellectual property associated with that.
Yeah.
And so multiple suppliers can create a similar chip. And so when you're working with all of this, the naming of that part number could be the exact same part with different part numbers and different suppliers. So with software, we've already had a hard enough problem saying that came from that supplier, whether it be Apple or Apple Inc. or this or that, because they buy other companies.
Sure.
Well, in this world, not only can they buy other companies, but they can relabel the exact same part to their own. So, like a white labeling of something else. So it's has the same engineering specs, but a totally different part name. So you really don't know where it's, what its real origin is.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the risks that an HBOM can kind of bring to the surface? I mean, is it an interdiction kind of question?
Yeah.
Is the chip a backdoor kind of? That's always the famous example. But
well, and it absolutely can be from a standpoint of let's just say the compliance, being able to, how can I delicately put this? There are nation states that may be attempting to implement backdoors into chips. And so understanding where those chips are manufactured and all of that,
sure.
which is, you can only have those, U.S. has created some lists, like I mentioned before, that said, you need to be concerned, but those can change. It can be a shell game.
Mm-hmm.
And so that risk continues to grow. And it's not where every single chip has an RFID tag and, it's easily identifiable. So there is risk that can be put into the chips, and it's a supply chain, so things move around, and things can happen or be intercepted,
mm-hmm.
or you may not get what you're doing. So just like the work that we've done in counterfeit detection in the past, you need to think of the same thing and go beyond that with cyber risk.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know what your experience is with those kinds of attacks, whether you've seen that kind of an incident, but it would seem it's a lot more involved than just kind of poisoning the chip. I mean, there's some targeting there as to knowing where the device is going, et cetera.
Right.
Is it realistic, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think that there have been reports, but nothing truly that I can refer back to.
Sure.
What I expect is there might be some classified reports. I don't have any security clearance, so I can't even guess or make comment on that. But when it comes to it can be so much more than just what's in the specs.
Right.
Because you really need to understand what should be there. And I've seen some excellent research talks and such at DEF CON and other areas.
Sure.
And there are absolute examples out there where additional technology and chips have been put on boards.
Yeah.
But those are, again, targeted or in specific cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that from a mass production standpoint, it's much harder to make that kind of change.
Sure.
So that's why I don't think we've seen any national news about that.
Right, makes sense. But in a different use case, it's more the compliance thing. It's like China's a no-go in my industry. That's kind of.
And there are certain regulations, and like the automotive has to have no Chinese in it by 2030, or I don't remember the exact one that's listed. But in that case, I don't see how it can be possibly met.
Sure.
That means all services, chips, what counts, that we've had for many years in the U.S., starting all the way back from made in the U.S. kind of stamps, right?
Right.
But you have made in America, made in by American. There's different acts, and that becomes an import-export compliance situation.
Right.
Along with, but a lot of it is because of cybersecurity risk coming up.
So is there a taxonomy of attributes that users should expect within a bill of materials?
There is no standard yet.
Okay.
The framework gave some ideas which didn't quite match what Cyclone DX, one of the bill of materials standards, and then SPDX, another one, that neither one of them are matching. They implement it different based off of how their standards, how their schemas are. So there's schemas that could support it, and there's that framework from CISA that I mentioned, but there's no standard.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that we really hope that in the coming years, maybe to get definitely a community together that would allow us to start working toward that standard, along with other ways, because you not only need a standard in this case, but you also need to be able to say, here is some of the mechanisms for sharing that information.
Right. So what does a user do with that data, with the bill of materials? Is it fed into something in the Security Operations Center, or?
It can.
How's it consumed?
So just like we can do it with counterfeit, we can identify and if there's a risk. A lot of that information that I've worked with is more based off country of origin. Like, where is the risk? What can you monitor? So there's supply chain risk management tools that can do that, and I can identify, I've got these parts from this chip manufacturer, it's going through these ports and doing that. So you're able to have that traceability, and also can identify supply chain risk or anything else. So let's say that company was compromised at a main level and it's at a manufacturing plant, you would be able to do some traceability. That's what hardware bill of materials could help give you.
So how would you characterize that? Are we like in early days of this in terms of developing these and adopting these?
Yeah, we're in the very, very, very early days. At this point, hardware bill of materials, if you talk to people in manufacturing, they're like, oh, we've had that forever. But the focus from a digital standpoint and being able to share that downstream to customers to give it, there's really nothing out there. It can take months to just collect one really accurate bill of materials, because you need to know based off of that plant and, let's say April of 2025, what was being in there at that time.
Right.
And that's where you get to the tricky situation, and then have to revalidate all the supplier data to see if the country of origin information is also accurate.
Otherwise, you're facing fines or...
Not really fines, but a lot of inaccuracy. So if, it's... I would not recommend creating one just for creating one. Yeah. We're, of course, monitoring our own supply chains, but it's really at the product level. So those that have equipment sold into critical infrastructure or military applications, they're used to being able to go down to that level. But they've also... many times custom developed chips or such, but commercial off the shelf, especially products that are used in routers and other equipment and things that are going to sit out there for 10, 15 years. You really, are you going to want to know 5 years from now what was put in there? Right. You're not going to know because you don't know if that one was produced in December or January.
Mm-hmm. So companies that don't have a hardware bill of materials, what are they doing in terms of visibility? Do you have to physically crack open the box to look at it? Or?
If they need the hardware bill of materials and they're not able to get a supplier and it's a certain situation and not part of a contract, then yes, they are. Yeah. Some companies, and they've done this for counterfeit in the past. Right. So they will, let's say someone's buying 1,000 laptops, they will open, a random and do inspections. Mm-hmm. But without that hardware bill of materials, then you have to inspect several different ones. And I've been working with over the last many years as a company with Department of Energy, where they do both the software analysis using SBOMs, and then they'll do a hardware analysis with product we ship them. Mm-hmm. And they will actually scrape the layers of the chip and do verification. But that is the extreme case. But I'm sure that in military applications, they're doing that to validate. There's lots of equipment that can validate that.
Are there industries where they matter more? Obviously in a military
definitely
context,
military, custom applications, when, military planes, anything related to space.
But a hospital, maybe not as much, for example.
Not as much. And, for example, the FDA does not have any hardware requirements that they're checking. They've just introduced the software bill of materials. But at this point, it is mainly from a risk standpoint for critical infrastructure.
Yeah. So, beyond the China kind of concern, what other things are they looking for? What else would kind of kick off a red flag?
So, let's just say, some of those chips, they're using drivers. So, being aware if there was any vulnerabilities or risks, or let's just say any kind of effects for a major chip manufacturer that has the drivers and the software development kits that are used with that. Okay. So I would, it's usually not the chip alone, because whatever the digital aspect of it, the ones and zeros on that chip that make it do things, you're looking at the attack paths for those vendors. So it could be the R&D group for that chip manufacturer.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And are there anything in an HBOM that could help, I'm caught off guard by a particular component being in there, like what kinds of things would an HBOM surface in that respect?
Well, I've seen many HBOMs, and it would highlight if it's being sold into the U.S. immediately. It'll highlight anything with CHN or China.
Sure.
So that was, and there's also analysis being done because of the Taiwanese manufacturing sites, and so what some companies are doing practices is looking for second suppliers, alternate suppliers, and qualifying, because this is not something like, I'll just decide to use this one this day. When you are using chips, you have to run through series of tests, battery of tests, basically a whole level of what we call qualification, and that takes months, and in some cases could take years to qualify new chips. And so if you are using certain part numbers and you have like second source and third source, those have all had engineering time dedicated to making sure that they will meet all of the standards, not just cybersecurity, but any kind of electrical standards, any kind of anything else related to that chip processing speed and such, and that takes so much time. So it's so by now, when you're making design decisions, companies are looking at, I want to avoid, ways that I might run into risk.
Yeah.
And that could be a cost difference because other countries that may produce a similar chip or other locations, the chip or the intelligent components, integrated circuits, whatever, could be much more expensive.
Yeah.
Or just more expensive or much more expensive. And so that changes the cost of good. And they're having to make that, as a decision. So if it's a small IoT device that $20, they're probably not going to go change what they're doing.
Yeah.
So there's there's that risk factor, but that's being done at the design stage now for products that won't be released for a year or two because it takes so long to do that.
So, but there is a shelf life to like how long an HBOM is valid. I mean, it's kind of like OT. This stuff lives for 20 years. That may not always be the case,
right?
Though.
And that's why we need HBOMs to be producible, really, for that product level, to be able to say this. Not only is it the revision for that, because when you're doing engineering designs, it'll say, I've qualified these 3 chips at this Rev 5 of the product. And we need to be able to have that available. And just like with software bill of materials, it's by release or version. We're going to need that for all the variations from the hardware bill of materials, because it changes over time. And that's even without all the details of that specific product, but just it's the base model.
Let's talk about maybe like some subtle benefits or some challenges. Like when I think of SBOMs, I think of like a real benefit to vulnerability management, for example. What kind of is the first thing that comes to mind to you, aside from the provenance stuff? That's always obvious, I think.
I would say it's a bit more limited. Because from a vulnerability standpoint, we can trace so much of that from the software point of view. So if you're looking at it from a cyber risk, there's a little bit more because of supply chains and channels, which I talked about earlier, but not to the level that software bill of materials are, and that's why it's not heavily adopted. Because a lot of people that have really driven the software bill of materials community have been the vulnerability management handlers.
For sure.
And there's not vulnerability management handlers for hardware. Not at the just core raw hardware.
Right. And so it's obviously a challenge. I mean, what's missing is in terms of adoption. I mean, we talked about it being relatively early days.
It's part of it is not having as much of a hardware community. I mean, there are so many people in the semiconductor space that are working together. So chip manufacturers. But then once you get past that to those that utilize the chips, automotive is doing one thing. You've got military applications and contractors. And then you have commercial off the shelf. Well, we have 15,000 digital products, software,
sure,
industrial, IoT, OT, all sorts of different things. So as a scale, it's important to us. But if somebody's only producing 5 IoT devices, unless they have to do something, they're not going to want to go to that level.
It's not
for hardware bill of materials.
Right.
And with not having that really central place that we can get a chance to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So even at this conference, I got to meet people from, let's just say, different laptop manufacturers, and they have lots of other items. And I asked them, are you doing anything with hardware bill of materials? Some of them went to our talk, and there's not a place for us to come together, a community, and that's why we haven't built anything, because there's not a community that's really built, and we all are being asked different things.
Yeah.
A laptop or server supplier is going to be asked different questions than maybe somebody who's running critical OT on their manufacturing floor or in their electrical utility. And so until we see customers, and I've gotten requests from some critical infrastructure customers asking for hardware bill of materials. I don't know if those same companies have gotten it, because that's more of an IT space.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't have anywhere to go and talk to this group of people, so we randomly know some of the people from software. But I asked, do you do work on the hardware side? And I'm, I guess, one of the few that is over both areas. And because the supply chain security to me is both software and hardware.
Right. I see a lot of working groups in your future.
Well, and if I would be excited if I could just get one working group. Because over the years, as part of the CISA SBOM working group, I'm like, I'm going to mention HBOM just for a second here, because I don't want it to be forgotten.
Yeah.
And we do. So so that's what I'm hoping. First with this talk, but others like me who need to really be prepared, even for a regulation, to start that conversation, because we can't wait. So.
Right. All right, so as a last question, what do you hope, if you come back a year from now and give a similar talk, what do you hope would have changed or evolved?
Well, it's probably that piece I just said, is to say, we have this group and we meet on these days, and here's our charter, and this is what we're working to produce. Yep. And so I truly hope 365 days from now we could have the same conversation, and I would have a roadmap that we've not had up till now.
Right. All right, Cassie. Great to meet you, and I learned something, so thank you.
All right. Good to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, bye-bye.